The cold on Valdris doesn't announce itself. It doesn't howl down from the ridgeline or rattle the prefab shutters the way you'd expect from a world that's trying to kill you. It just settles in, quiet as a debt, and by the time you feel it in your marrow, you've already been losing the argument for an hour. I learned that in my first week on the colony. I learned most of what I needed to know about Valdris in that first week, if I'm being honest. The cold. The dark that falls like a curtain at 3 in the afternoon from the second month onward. The way the supply manifests always came up 2 containers short, and the way the Veth watched you unload them with those flat amber eyes that caught the landing lights like coins at the bottom of a well. The Veth. I should explain the Veth, because most people who weren't there have an idea of them that doesn't match reality. They're large. The adults run close to 2 meters at the shoulder on all fours, and they stand on their hind legs when they want to indicate formal address or outright threat. They have layered coats, a dense wool underlayer and long guard hairs on top that shed water and ice the way good oilskin does. Their faces are long, their ears high and mobile, their eyes set forward for predator depth perception. If you're looking for a word, the word is wolf-like, but that undersells them the way calling a thunderstorm a weather event undersells it. They are predatory in the way that gravity is predatory. It isn't malice. It's just what they are down to the architecture of them. They communicate in 2 registers. There's the vocal layer chirps, low rumbles, the occasional sharp bark that carries surface meaning, logistics, fact. And then there's the subvocal layer, the thing the xenobiologists called resonance bonding and the Veth themselves had no human word for. Pack members share it. They don't read each other's thoughts exactly, but they feel each other's states. Fear moves through a Veth pack the way heat moves through copper wire fast and without announcement. So does grief. I was a staff sergeant in the Colonial Liaison Corps, which sounds more impressive than it was. My actual job was to stand between human decisions and Veth decisions, and prevent them from becoming Veth actions taken against human bodies. I'd had the posting for 14 months when the second winter came down on Valdris. I spoke passable low Veth, enough to be understood, which put me in the top 4% of humans on the planet. That's not a compliment to me. That's an indictment of how little effort the colonial authority had put into understanding the people whose world we were borrowing. The pack I was attached to was called, in rough translation, the Thornback Pack. 8 adults. 3 juveniles they called Yang, I'll call them young because that's close enough, and a breeding pair's litter of 5 newborns that the Veth called Vethkai, which translates to something between cubs and heartstones. The word carries both meanings, the diminutive of their species name and the Veth concept of something that is worth protecting at the center of all things. The mother of the litter was named Sarah. The father was Korvath, the pack alpha. He was the largest Veth I had ever stood close to, and I had been close to him many times. He stood just over 3 meters when he drew himself upright, and he had a scar through his left ear from a territorial dispute that had apparently happened before the colony ships came. He smelled of pine resin and something metallic, and when he looked at me, there was always a calculation happening behind those eyes that I couldn't fully read. For most of that second autumn, my relationship with the Thornback Pack was functional. Professional, if you want to use that word for something that happened without suits or conference rooms. They tolerated my presence at their settlement perimeter because I had twice flagged colonial authority decisions that would have damaged their hunting range, and because I was the one who had negotiated their access to the emergency medical stores when a sub-pack to the north had come down with a respiratory sickness the previous spring. They didn't like me. They didn't dislike me. I was, in their accounting, useful, a tool that had not yet broken. That changed in the storm. It came down from the northern ridge on the 41st day of what the colony calendar called deep winter. The atmospheric monitors had been giving increasingly unreliable readings because 2 of the 3 orbital weather platforms had degraded, budget cuts, the same budget cuts that had shorted our supply manifests. And so, when the storm came, it came with less warning than it should have. We had maybe 90 minutes of advance notice from the ridge-mounted ground sensors, and 90 minutes on Valdris in deep winter is enough time to secure yourself and your equipment, and not much else. I was in the perimeter relay station, a prefab box about the size and comfort of a freight container, running a routine comms log when the alert came through. I looked at the sensor data for about 15 seconds, then I sealed my suit and went outside. The Veth settlement was 200 meters across open ground from the relay station. It was a series of low shelters built into the southern face of a rock formation. Smart positioning. The rock blocked the worst of the northern wind, with a communal space at the center that served as den, meeting ground, and the place where the Vethkai were kept. The newborns, Sarah's 5. They were not in the main den when I got to the settlement. I knew this because the Thornback pack was in the communal space, and they were in a state I had never seen them in before. The resonance bonding was doing something I didn't have words for. It wasn't quite visible, but you could feel it the way you feel a subsonic vibration in your teeth. The adult Veth were moving in tight orbits around each other, heads low, that long mobile fur along their spines raised flat in a way I had learned to associate with suppressed panic. Corvath was standing still at the center of it, and he was the most frightening thing in the group because he wasn't moving at all. Sarah was not there. I found out in pieces, through my broken low Veth and Corvath's reluctant translation into the colonial pidgin he had learned for dealing with authority officials, what had happened. Sarah had taken the Vethkai outside the settlement that morning, a normal thing, a brief airing, the kind of thing mothers of any species do, and had left them in a secondary shelter 60 meters north of the rock formation while she returned to retrieve something. Food, I think. A specific kind of dried meat the Veth prepare for nursing mothers. While she was gone, the storm had sent its leading edge down the ridge. Not the main body, just the advance wind shear, 60 kilometers an hour of super-chilled air carrying ice pellets the size of small stones. The secondary shelter was a light structure, meant for summer. It had come apart. By the time Sarah reached her cubs, the 5 Vethkai were scattered. The storm's full force was 20 minutes out. She had managed to locate 3 of them and carry them back. The other 2 she could not find in the whiteout. She had gone back in 3 times. Each time she came back with nothing. Now she was in the den with her 3 survivors, and the 2 remaining Vethkai were somewhere in 60 meters of increasingly impenetrable storm ground. Corvath told me all of this in the flat, careful tone I had learned to associate with Veth stoicism in crisis. The emotional content, the resonance layer, was a different story. I could feel it even as a non-pack human, that subsonic wrongness, the way you feel the air pressure drop before lightning. We have calculated, Corvath said, in his careful pidgin, that sending an adult into current conditions represents unacceptable pack resource expenditure for uncertain recovery probability. The 2 Vethkai may already be incapacitated beyond survival threshold. The adult who goes risks certain exposure damage for uncertain result. This is not sound accounting. He wasn't wrong. Veth survival logic is brutal and it is usually correct. You don't spend resources you don't have on returns you can't guarantee. A pack is a machine for surviving, and the machine has to keep running even when parts of it are lost. That's not cruelty. It's the arithmetic of things that want to stay alive in places that want them dead. I stood there in the communal space with ice already forming on the shoulders of my suit, and I listened to him explain the arithmetic, and I looked at Sarah through the den entrance. Her 3 cubs pressed against her belly, her eyes open and fixed on the far wall, and I thought about the word Vethkai, heartstones, the thing worth protecting at the center of all things. I'll go, I said. Corvath looked at me for a long moment. His ear, the scarred one, swiveled. The human unit does not know Thornback territory. The human unit does not have pack bond locator capability. The human unit's thermal regulation is insufficient for. Tell me the last known position, I said, both of them. Another long moment, then he told me. I went back to the relay station first. I had 3 minutes to grab what I needed. Emergency thermal blanket folded to the size of a paperback book. The spare medical kit, not the full kit, the compact one, because weight matters when you're fighting wind. An extra charge cell for my suit's heating elements, which I hot-swapped immediately because the elements had already been running for the 20 minutes I'd been standing outside in the settlement. The tether line I kept for ice field work, 50 meters of braided composite that would hold half a metric ton. I clipped the tether to the relay station's anchor point at waist height, where the secondary ring was rated for load-bearing, because if I got turned around in the whiteout, the line would give me a direction back. I had been turned around in whiteouts before. It happens faster than people think. One moment you are oriented. The next moment the wind shifts and there is nothing in any direction that tells you where you came from, and the world is just white noise and pressure. I stood inside the relay station door for exactly 30 seconds before I went out. I counted them, not because I was afraid, or not only because of that, but because I had learned in cold weather training that felt very theoretical at the time, that 30 seconds of controlled breathing before entering severe conditions improves your performance in the first critical minutes, when the shock of the environment is at its worst, and the decisions you make are at their most consequential. I thought about the arithmetic while I breathed. I thought about Veth laying it out in his careful pigeon, and I thought about Sarah's eyes fixed on the far wall of the den, and I thought about the word Vethkai, heartstones, the thing worth protecting at the center of all things. I checked my suit seals, turned my heating elements to full, and went back out into it. The storm by then was not a weather event. It was a presence. It had weight and intention, or at least it felt that way when you were standing in it. The wind was coming from the nor-northwest at somewhere around 80 kilometers per hour with gusts above that, carrying ice that hit exposed surfaces with an audible hiss. Not the sound of snow, softer than snow, but the sound of ice crystals moving at velocity, and the difference matters because ice crystals at that speed will find every imperfection in a seal and work at it the way water works at rock. Patient, systematic, indifferent to your preferences. My visor was doing its best, but the heating element on the left side was running behind, and a line of ice was building up in the lower corner of my field of view. Not enough to block anything critical yet, but I noted it and filed it in the part of my mind that keeps running inventory even when the rest of me is engaged in other problems. I couldn't see more than 4 meters ahead. In good visibility, from the relay station to the secondary shelter location, was a walk you could do with your eyes closed, familiar ground, unremarkable terrain. In the storm, it was like moving through a different world entirely, one that had never heard of landmarks and didn't intend to introduce any. I knew the general position Veth had given me, 60 meters north, offset 20 meters west from the settlement's north face. The secondary shelter had been in a shallow depression between 2 rock formations, minor windbreak, as it turned out, not enough. I went north, keeping the tether line running through my left hand, watching the tension. If I veered too far east or west, I'd feel it. The line was the only reliable information I had. The first 15 meters were the worst because I was still close enough to the settlement that I was in the turbulence zone, where the storm wind came off the rock face in unpredictable eddies. I went down once, knee to ground, when a gust hit me from the side. Got up, kept moving. At 25 meters out, I hit the first of what I can only describe as the true storm. Even through the suit, I could feel the cold as a pressure, a compression, working at every seal and seam. The heating elements were fighting it and winning, barely. I had perhaps 40 minutes of effective operation before the math started going bad. I swept left and right as I went, feeling with my boots for anything that wasn't ice-flat ground, calling out in low Veth because I had been told the Vethkai would recognize a Veth voice pattern and might respond. My low Veth is bad, but it was what I had. I called the sound that roughly translates as "I am here, you are safe," a pack call that Veth mothers used to locate young in darkness. I had learned it from listening. I had no idea if my accent made it recognizable or gibberish. At approximately 40 meters out, I almost stepped on the first one. It was tucked against a flat rock, pressed into the smallest space it could find, the long guard hairs completely matted with ice. Newborn Veth are roughly the size of a large dog, built heavier than that suggests, and they have an instinct to go still and small in danger rather than to move. This one had found a shallow crevice in the rock face and pushed itself in as far as its body would allow. I nearly walked past it in the whiteout. I got my hands under it. It was heavy and completely rigid with cold, and I had a bad half-second where I thought I was too late, but then it moved a small convulsive shudder, the body trying to generate heat. Alive, functioning just barely. I wrapped it in the thermal blanket, all but its face, and held it against my chest inside the fold of my outer layer where my suit's heating was concentrated. I could feel it shaking. I kept moving north, calling the pack call, the tether line feeding out behind me. The second cub was harder to find. I spent 11 minutes searching the area Veth had described, moving in expanding arcs, fighting the wind for every step, burning through my heating element reserves. At one point I stopped moving entirely because the wind had come up to something I couldn't push through upright, and I crouched over the first cub and waited for the gust to drop, and in the relative quiet of that lull I heard something. Not a vocalization, more like the absence of something. A small disturbance in the storm sound, a muffled irregularity. I had been in enough bad weather to know that buried things change the sound of wind around them. I went toward it. The second cub was under nearly 15 centimeters of drifted ice, in what had been the shelter's supply alcove before the structure came apart. Only a slight mounding in the drift marked it, and only because I was looking at ground level with my visor inches from the surface could I see that the mound was shaped wrong for natural accumulation. I dug with my hands, pulled it free. Also alive. Also barely. There was no room in the thermal blanket for both of them and have it function properly. I undid the fastenings on my outer thermal layer, a decision I would pay for in bruising cold against my suit's inner skin, and wrapped the second cub in that instead, tucking it against my other side, and then I turned around and followed the tether line back. I don't have a dramatic account of the return trip. It was 50 meters of wind and ice, and the growing awareness that my suit's left side heating element was losing its argument with the cold in a way that would start causing tissue damage to my left arm if I didn't get indoors shortly. I kept my body angled to protect both cubs. I kept my grip on the tether. I walked. At some point, I didn't see it happen because I was looking at the ground. The thornback pack came out to meet me. I knew they were there before I saw them because the pressure of the storm changed, because there were bodies around me breaking the wind. I looked up and there was Veth on my left side, close enough that his bulk was actually blocking the worst of the north wind from hitting me directly, and two of the pack hunters on my right forming a similar barrier, and the rest of the adults arrayed in a loose formation ahead and behind, cutting the ground wind. They had come out into the storm they had calculated was unsurvivable for a single adult, and they were using their bodies as a windbreak to walk me back in. Nobody said anything. There wasn't anything to say. They walked me to the den entrance. Inside, the temperature differential was immediate and stunning, warm, smoke-heated air, the smell of the Veth communal space, close and animal and not unpleasant. I went to my knees, not theatrically, just because my legs had decided they were done being professional about it. I held out the two cubs. Sarah was there. She moved faster than anything that size should be able to move. She had both cubs against her before I'd fully processed the motion, and she was doing what Veth mothers do, that rapid assessment examination, working over every inch of them with nose and tongue, cataloging damage, checking function. The 3 cubs she had already saved pushed themselves toward their siblings. The whole cluster of them pressed together in the instinctive pile that generates shared warmth. Both the lost cubs were alive. They had damage, some surface frostbite on the extremities, which the Veth treat with a technique involving their saliva that the xenobiologists had not fully mapped yet, and which works better than you'd expect, but both were alive and both would recover fully. I found that out 3 days later. In the moment, I only knew they were alive because they were moving and making sound. I sat on the floor of the Veth den and pulled off my outer gloves to check my hands, because I could feel the early stages of frostbite in my left fingers and I needed to assess. The skin was waxy and pale, and the sensation was wrong in a specific way that meant I had work to do. I dug out the medical kit and started the treatment protocol, which is not complicated but requires attention. Hot pack application, controlled rewarming, monitoring for the specific ache that tells you the tissue is coming back. The pack was around me. They were doing the thing with the resonance bonding. I could feel it differently now, a different quality to the subsonic presence. Not panic, something else. I don't have a word for what it was in English, and I'm not sure the Veth word for it would translate cleanly. The closest I can get is the feeling of a debt being recognized before it can be named. Corvath came and sat near me, not close enough to crowd, just close enough to be unmistakably present. He watched me work on my hands for a while. The human unit's calculation was irrational, he said, in his careful pidgin. Yes, I said. The probability of recovery was low. The probability of personal damage was high. The arithmetic was not favorable. No, I said, it wasn't. His ear swiveled, the scarred one. The human unit proceeded anyway. Yes. He was quiet for a while. I finished the initial treatment on my left hand and started on my right, which was in better shape. The cubs were in a pile against Sarah, all 5 of them now, making the small sounds that indicated warmth and presence and the beginning of feeding. The storm outside was at its full intensity, the wind against the rock formation making a sound like continuous low thunder. Why? Corvath said. It wasn't really a question. It was the Veth way of opening a space in conversation that the other party could choose to fill or not. I thought about it for a moment, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to give him the real one instead of the easy one. Because they were there, I said. Because they were alive. Because the arithmetic doesn't account for everything. He looked at me. I looked at him. The fire in the central heating element of the den, a Veth-built thing, ceramic and bone and packed earth, far more efficient than anything the colonial authority had designed, threw shifting light across his face and made the amber of his eyes look like something burning inside. The pack arithmetic, he said carefully, does not include the concept of spending a member's capacity for an uncertain outcome. I know, I said. Humans include this concept. Some humans, I said, more than you'd think. Explain the mechanism, he said. Another Veth construction, not a demand, not a request, just an indication that he was willing to receive information if I was willing to give it. I looked at my hands. The treatment was working. The color was coming back in the slow tidal way it does after cold exposure, the pink creeping in from the base of my fingers toward the tips. I don't think there is a mechanism, I said. I think it's more like a refusal, a decision that the arithmetic is wrong and that you're going to act against it and find out. I paused. It's not always right. Sometimes the arithmetic was right all along and the person who acted against it just dies. That happens. And yet the behavior persists in the species. Yes. This suggests, Corvath said slowly, as if working through a problem in real time, that the benefit of the behavior in the cases where it succeeds is sufficient to maintain it in the population, despite the cost in the cases where it does not. Maybe, I said, or maybe it's not about the population at all. Maybe it's just what a person is sometimes, what they're capable of when the alternative is living with having chosen differently. He sat with that for a long time. Then, the pack arithmetic does not account for the cost of not acting. No, I said, it doesn't. Humans account for this cost. Some humans, I said, more than you'd think. He sat with that for a while. I wrapped my hands and put my gloves back on and let the den's warmth do its work on me. And gradually, the feeling came back to my fingers in the specific painful way that means the tissue is intact and functioning, and I counted that as a win. The storm ran for 2 more days. I stayed in the Veth settlement for the duration, because going back to the relay station would have been stupid, and Veth indicated, in the way the Veth indicate things, a posture, a slight adjustment of the ears, the absence of the body language that means you should leave, that I was not expected to. I slept in the communal space on a mat that one of the pack hunters brought me without ceremony, ate the ration packs I'd had the presence of mind to grab, and watched the Thornback pack move through their days in close quarters. I had spent 14 months adjacent to this pack, and I had not been inside their settlement before. Not really inside, not like that. There's a difference between being permitted in the communal space for formal discussions and being present the way I was present during those 2 storm days, part of the backdrop, unremarkable, a thing that was just there the way a piece of furniture is there. They stopped performing normal around me. They just were normal. It was the most education I received in my 14 months on Valdris, those 2 days. I watched how the juveniles interacted with the adults, the complex system of earned deference and protected development. The juveniles, the 3 Yang, were at an age where everything was still a test, every interaction a lesson in how the pack worked. I watched them position themselves carefully relative to the adults, reading posture and resonance the way a good young soldier reads the room. Not deferential in a broken way. Deferential in the way that means I understand what I don't know yet. There's a difference, and the Veth juveniles had it. I watched how the pack managed the resonance bonding consciously, dampening it, amplifying it, using it as a kind of communal mood regulation in the way a good human unit manages morale. When one of the pack hunters came back from a perimeter check with her anxiety running high from something she'd heard in the storm, a sound she couldn't identify, the senior hunters around her did something deliberate with their bonding, a kind of sustained calm that I could feel as a low, steadying pressure in the air. The anxiety didn't vanish. It was contained, shared and distributed until no single member was carrying more than their portion of it. I thought about what that would feel like, to be that connected. I thought about the human equivalent, the way a good unit operates when it's working right, when you know the people around you well enough to read them without words, when the morale of the group becomes almost a physical thing you can feel and manage. The Veth had made that into biology, or biology had made them into that. Either way, the result was something I recognized even if the mechanism was entirely foreign. I watched Sarah with her cubs, the constant low-level attention that never quite became hovering, the way she trusted the other pack adults to hold and warm the cubs when she needed to eat or sleep. The 2 I had brought back she handled differently from the other 3 at first. More checking, more of the nose and tongue assessment repeated, reassuring herself that the damage was healing. By the 2nd day, she was treating all 5 the same again, which struck me as the right thing in a way I couldn't have articulated clearly. And I watched Veth. He watched me back. That was a negotiation without words, and I am not sure either of us knew exactly what was being negotiated. But by the time the storm broke, I had the sense that something had been decided between us. On the 3rd morning, the wind dropped and the light came back. Valdris's sun is further away than Earth standard, and the light is always a little pale, a little thin, like light that has been asked to do too much, and I gathered my kit and prepared to go back to the relay station. Veth met me at the settlement edge. He reached out and placed his forepaw, his hand, I should say. They have functional manipulators at the end of the forelimbs, and calling them paws is an insult to the dexterity involved on my left arm, the arm I damaged in the storm. He pressed very gently, feeling through my outer layer to the arm beneath. "The damage," he said, "is it contained?" "Yes," I said, "it'll heal." He held his hand there for another moment. The amber eyes looked at me without calculation, for once. Or maybe with a different kind of calculation, one that I didn't have the background to read correctly. The Veth, he said, are pack-bonded now to the memory of the storm. The resonance will carry it. Their descendants will carry it. He paused. The pack arithmetic has been updated. I didn't quite understand that last sentence at the time. I understood it better, months later, when I had learned more Lo Veth, and could have a real conversation with the pack's elder, a female called Tessara who had been managing Thornback's historical memory for going on 40 years. Tessara explained it to me in terms that took about an hour to get through and that I'll compress here. The Veth have a concept of pack memory that functions something like institutional knowledge but rooted in the resonance bonding. Critical events, events that rewrite how the pack understands survival, don't just get remembered. They get encoded. They become part of how the pack bond is shaped for the next generation. The event in the storm had become one of those memories, not because it was dramatic, or at least not only because of that, but because it had introduced a genuine logical anomaly into Thornback Pack's model of the world. The arithmetic had always said, "Do not spend certain capacity for uncertain return." The arithmetic had worked for generations, and then a single human unit had violated the arithmetic spectacularly, and the uncertain return had come back alive. Tessara said the pack bond now held a specific concept it hadn't had before. She used a word I hadn't heard, Veth. She translated it for me, laboriously, as the calculation that cannot be made from inside the system. The idea being that sometimes the math looks impossible from the inside because you're using the wrong variables. That sometimes the thing you're not accounting for is the thing that changes everything. That sometimes what looks like irrationality from one angle is a different kind of rationality from another. They had a word for it now. They'd made one. That's what Corvath had meant when he said the pack arithmetic had been updated. I don't tell this story to make myself sound heroic. I was scared in that storm, genuinely and thoroughly scared, in the way that you get scared when your body understands the situation better than your mind wants to. My hands didn't work properly for 2 weeks afterward. I have a recurring deep cold sensation in my left arm when the temperature drops fast, 14 months after the fact, that the medical team assures me is nerve response normalization and will resolve eventually. I note that they have been saying this for over a year. I've also had time to think about whether I made the right call. That's the honest thing to include here, because anyone who tells you they've done something risky and never second-guessed it is either lying or hasn't spent enough quiet time with the memory. There were moments during those 2 days in the storm settlement when I ran the numbers, and they came out the same way they'd come out for Corvath. Low probability of recovery, high probability of personal damage. The arithmetic, as he had said, was not favorable. What I came back to every time was this: the arithmetic assumes you know the right variables. Corvath's arithmetic was correct given what he knew. It didn't account for the specific tolerance of a human body for cold, which is not exceptional but is calibrated differently from a Veth body. We have less insulating surface area, but we generate internal heat differently. We're built for a different kind of endurance. It didn't account for the tether, which changed the survival math significantly. It didn't account for the particular shape of that secondary shelter's remains, the way it had come apart in a pattern that left a usable pocket of still air, which meant the cubs had been cold, but not as cold as open exposure would have made them. But mostly it didn't account for the human willingness to be stupid in a very specific and determined way. The willingness to say the arithmetic is wrong because I refuse to let the arithmetic be right. That's not logical. It's also not, I think, irrational. It's something else. Something that I have never found a clean word for in English, and that the Veth apparently needed to make a new word to describe. What I tell it for is this: I had spent 14 months trying to build a functional working relationship with the Thornback pack on the basis of professional utility. I had translated, mediated, flagged problems, run interference. All of it useful. None of it, quite. What I think the colonial authority had hoped for when they invented the liaison corps, which was something like genuine understanding between our two species. The colonial authority's model of interspecies relations was transactional. We have these resources, you have those, let us find the exchange rate. As models go, it was not wrong. It just wasn't enough. What happened in the storm was not policy. It was not mediation or translation or flagged concerns submitted in triplicate. It was me going out into something I probably shouldn't have survived and coming back with what I'd gone for, and the Veth understanding something about humans that they had not understood before, not as a concept in a briefing document, but as a lived fact, encoded in their bonding memory, passed to the cubs who would carry it forward. Sarah came to me, the morning after the storm broke, with both of the cubs I'd retrieved. She set them down in front of me and stepped back. They were mobile by then, unsteady but functional, working their legs with the deliberate concentration of things that are still figuring out what their bodies can do. They came toward me, because I was the closest warm body, and Veth cubs lack social fear at that age, and climbed on me with absolute unself-consciousness, and Sarah watched this happen and made no move to stop it. That was the closest thing the Veth had to a formal statement. I understood it the way you understand things that don't translate, the way you understand a soldier offering you his last dry match in a wet field. Some things are in the gesture and nowhere else. The colonial administration sent a commendation, eventually. Interspecies relations enhancement, the citation said, in recognition of actions taken to preserve diplomatic accord. I filed it with the rest of the paperwork and didn't think about it much. What I think about, when I think about Valdris at all, is the weight of those two cubs on the way back in. One under each arm, inside my layers, shaking against my ribs in the dark and the cold. Heavy as things that matter are always heavy, and the tether line feeding through my left hand, giving me direction when there was nothing else to go on. And the pack around me on the way home, those massive bodies using themselves as a windbreak without being asked, without calculation, without making it anything more than what it was. Maybe that was their version of the same equation. Maybe that's the thing neither of us had words for at the time, that the arithmetic changes when the variables do, and sometimes the variable that changes everything is watching something impossible happen and deciding you believe in it. I still have the scar on my left arm where the cold did its worst work. On bad mornings I can feel it the way you feel an old truth, not comfortable but familiar, something earned. Tessara told me, in our last conversation before I rotated off Valdris, that the 5 Vethkai of Sarah's litter would be called something specific in Thornback pack memory. Not by their individual names, though they had those, by a shared designation. She told me the word, and I asked her to translate it, and she thought about it for a long moment in the way the elder Veth think about things that don't translate easily. The carried, she said finally, the ones who were carried back. I nodded, that was good enough for me. Outside the den, the Valdris winter was settling in for another long haul. The pale sun had already started its early descent, the sky going from thin gray to the deep blue-black that was the colony's idea of late afternoon. Somewhere out past the rock formation, the Thornback pack was moving through their evening range check, those amber eyes catching the last of the light, the resonance bonding humming below the threshold of what I could hear. I picked up my kit and walked back across the open ground to the relay station, and the cold came with me, and I let it.